Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
With just days to go before EU leaders gather in Brussels for Sunday's crucial summit on Brexit, British and EU negotiators have finally agreed a draft political declaration on the UK's future relationship with the EU. It covers trade, security and foreign affairs, but it is not legally binding and still needs signing off by the other 27 EU leaders. Here are the main points. The 26-page document outlines plans for an ambitious economic partnership between the UK and the EU. It says the UK will be allowed to pursue an independent trade policy with other countries. It says Brexit will end the free movement of EU citizens wanting to come and live in the UK, but that will also apply to British citizens wanting to move to the EU. And on the issue that's caused much concern, the efforts to stop a hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, it says they'll work on new technology to ensure that doesn't happen. But the European Court of Justice will still play a role in UK affairs, which many Brexiteers are unhappy about. And this afternoon, the Prime Minister faced widespread criticism in the Commons as she defended her draft Brexit deal. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar.
Here she was again. Mrs May hasn't had much to crow about lately, but months of wrangling in Brussels had finally delivered at least the outline of a plan to take to Parliament. She couldn't wait that long.
This is the right deal for the UK. It delivers on the vote of the referendum. It brings back control of our borders, our money and our laws. And it does so while protecting jobs, protecting our security and protecting the integrity of the United Kingdom. The agreement we've reached is between the UK and the European Commission. It is now up to the 27 leaders of the other EU member states to examine this agreement in the days leading up to the special EU Council meeting on Sunday.
Not many cheerleaders for this plan. She did the job herself.
The British people want this to be settled. They want a good deal that sets us on course for a brighter future. That deal is within our grasp, and I am determined to deliver it.
So the wheels haven't come off, not yet anyway. Up ahead, her critics were waiting. Brexiteers, former Remainers, who also think Britain's heading blindly into a weaker position with no time limit, and the opposition, all keen to stop Mrs May in her tracks. The Brexit divorce deal was facing opposition on all sides already. The new deal for the future after Brexit talks about improving and building on a customs relationship, a relationship that's far too close to the EU for the Brexiteers already. The deal talks about considering the use of new technology to avoid a hard Irish border, but that's on top of the customs relationship, not instead of it. The European Court would have the last word in legal disputes on European law where there's any dispute on any future agreement. That's another letdown for the Eurosceptics, and there is no guarantee Britain could pull out of a customs relationship if it comes about on its own initiative, when it wants, and sign new trade deals. It all added up to a hard sell in the Commons.
Order. Statement. The Prime Minister.
She needed support, wanted to move on.
The negotiations are now at a critical moment, and all our efforts must be focused on working with our European partners to bring this process to a final conclusion in the interests of all our people.
The Labour leader had other ideas.
We have 26 pages of waffle.
He's been accused of lacking clarity. That was his charge against Mrs May.
This empty document could have been written 2 years ago. It's peppered with phrases such as the parties will look at, the parties will explore. What on earth has the government been doing for the last 2 years?
Brexiteers hated the idea of being stuck in a close customs relationship under the so-called backstop plan if a trade deal takes too long.
We have the horror of being in the customs union, the horror of Northern Ireland being split off under a different regime.
And a potential leadership contender piled in.
We should junk forthwith the backstop upon which the future economic partnership, according to this political declaration, is to be based.
Some Tories fear losing control of UK fishing grounds. The SNP agrees.
Scotland's fishing rights thrown overboard as if they were discarded fish. So much for taking back control. more like trading away Scotland's interests.
The pressures may be mounting for a fresh referendum.
Now that we're in a position to ask people for their informed consent, that really is the time for a people's vote on this final deal.
But Mrs May has support too, and they made themselves heard.
Outside this House, there's a much higher appreciation of the tenacity of the Prime Minister in pursuing a successful deal than we sometimes hear inside it.
The Prime Minister met her Austrian counterpart today. Getting agreement in Europe has been hard, but that looks like being the easy bit. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
So the plan now is that Theresa May and the other 27 EU leaders will meet in Brussels on Sunday to sign off on both today's draft political declaration and the draft withdrawal agreement, which was published last week. Our Europe editor, Katya Adler, has been looking at the detail of the political declaration.
Theresa May says this deal is the right one for the UK. But does it live up to her Brexit promises? And even if it's right for the UK, what about the rest of the EU? This text is being studied now in all 27 EU capitals. One of the key issues at the heart of the EU referendum was taking back control. Now, you have frequent mention in this document of UK sovereignty and also of an independent UK trading policy. It's also made very clear here that after Brexit, the freedom of movement of EU citizens to come and live and work in the UK is over. Theresa May said after Brexit, the UK would leave the single market but could still enjoy frictionless trade with the EU. Well, that's not in here because the EU wants to drive home the point that if you leave the single market, you can't have the same benefits. But this is ambitious on trade. It calls for the ease of trade between the EU and UK and to have as close a trade relationship as possible. For those who dislike the wording of the Irish border guarantee in the other Brexit document, the withdrawal agreement, they'll be relieved to see here that the EU and the UK say they're going to work hard to find alternatives, such as using technologies when they're up and running. And for others who worried that they were going to be staying in a customs union with the EU forever, there is no mention here of a union, but of ambitious customs arrangements, which clearly is open to interpretation. There's no mention of Gibraltar in this document, despite the recent political spat. The EU sees the issue as bilateral between the UK and Spain and expects it will be resolved by the Brexit summit on Sunday. France's demand to fish in UK waters isn't addressed in the text either, which vaguely says fishing rights will have to be sorted out by July 2020. This is where the Prime Minister comes on Sunday to meet EU leaders in the expectation that they'll sign off on these Brexit texts. But don't forget, the political declaration is not a final trade deal. It's not legally binding, so it's sort of designed to be all things to all people. In the hope, too, this will help Theresa May sell her Brexit deal to the House of Commons. Katya Adler, BBC News, Brussels.
Well, let's go to Westminster now and speak to our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar. A final Brexit deal is within our grasp, says the Prime Minister, but just to be clear, there is still a very long way to go, isn't there?
Yes, that's right. This draft declaration was never likely to disarm the danger of Mrs May's Brexit plan being voted down here in Parliament next month, and it hasn't. Some in the Cabinet are already anticipating that defeat and looking beyond it, talking of the possibility of having another go after that seriously damaging defeat which seems now so likely. Now, others still, those who never liked Mrs May's Brexit plan, are anticipating defeat and hoping for a chance after that defeat to bend Brexit their way, to go back to fresh negotiations and get some sort of deal more to the taste of the Brexiteers. That looks to many like a pretty distant prospect, an outside chance, but that certainly is their hope. And meanwhile, the pressure and the pleading will go on at full stretch, and it may just succeed in peeling off some of the Brexiteers, may even convince some Labour MPs to join the government and help get the deal through. But will it succeed? Well, you won't find many people betting very much, Sophie, or anything at all on that here at Westminster this evening.
John Pienaar, thank you.
Let's return now to the latest on Brexit. The Prime Minister insisting that a Brexit deal is within our grasp after British and European negotiators agreed draft plans for the future partnership. well, Shadow Brexit Secretary Sir Keir Starmer, joins me now. Thank you very much, Sir Keir, for joining us.
Not at all.
So your leader calls it waffle, blindfold Brexit, a botched negotiation. So let's just be clear, it probably goes without saying you're going to vote now against this when it comes to the meaningful vote.
Yeah, we will vote against this. It's a really bitterly disappointing document, and I think if you heard any of the debate in the House of Commons this afternoon, what you'll have picked up is MPs on both sides of the House saying this is just a wish list. It's a list of the available options. What we needed at this stage of the negotiations was a concrete plan for the future. You can't have the detailed agreement, I accept that, but you need a concrete plan. This just lists the options. It's a document, frankly, that could have been written at the beginning of the exercise, not the end of the exercise.
But isn't that slightly unfair? I mean, it is a political declaration, really. I mean, how can there be more detail, as you conceded just then, when nothing can be properly negotiated until we've left the EU?
Well, you can agree principles. You can actually agree what you're going to do. Of course, it wouldn't be legally binding. But just to say that because it's not legally binding, it's perfectly all right to have a sort of wish list or list of options that don't tell you where you're going. It doesn't make sense. Of course it's not legally binding, but it doesn't mean it shouldn't be a clear plan with principles about what's actually been agreed. What this indicates is that basically nothing's been agreed in the 2 years about the future relationship. And for the Prime Minister to say, well, I haven't really agreed anything, these are just the options, I don't know which of them we're actually going to do, but please vote for it anyway, is something which, as you can see, is unacceptable across the House of Commons.
But look, at least it's a deal. The country is seeing her trying to make way here, make the best of it, battling away. They still don't know really where you stand. And, I mean, isn't it fantasy to think that you or anyone else could negotiate a better deal now? Why should they give a better deal?
Well, you say at least it's a deal, the assumption being that as long as it's got the word deal at the top and is signed by 28 countries, that it's therefore somehow acceptable. We are talking, after all, about the future relationship between the UK and the EU for decades to come. And to simply say at this stage, well, at least it's a deal, it may not be very good, it's certainly pretty vague, but there's nothing really else apart from no deal, so you better go along with it. That is no way for this Parliament, whichever side you're on, to proceed. And that's not right for the country. You wouldn't expect a Member of Parliament to say, well, I know it's not really very good, there's no detail in it, but hey-ho, it's better than nothing, so I'll vote for it.
Right, but isn't your problem politically...
And you would challenge me.
Yeah,
you would challenge me very, very hard.
Yeah, but, you know, I'm still, you know, struggling to see where you stand, and that's my point. I mean, your problem politically, and I mean your personal problem politically, is that you think there should be a second referendum, but your leader doesn't.
Well, the party policy says that the first thing we do is judge the deal by the test that we set and vote on it. That's the stage we're at the moment. We will probably get a vote, I'd imagine, in the second week of December. So that's stage one. If the deal doesn't get through, then we, the Labour Party, but actually the whole House of Commons has to decide what do we do next.
Yeah, but if the deal if the deal gets voted down, which it looks like it will do, are we closer, in your view, are we closer to a second referendum, to you getting your way?
Well, we then have to look at what the other options are. Of course, we say that there should be a general election because it would be a failure of the negotiations, and we'll have to see.
Yeah, but that's highly unlikely, Sir Keir. That's highly unlikely. I mean, are we closer, in your view? Are we closer, in your view, to a second referendum?
Well, you say it's highly unlikely. The number of times in the last 2-3 years people have said things are highly unlikely and then they happen as a number to remember. But actually we go through, but we have said, I'll press on, if there isn't a general election, then other options, including a public vote, is the option of a public vote is the Labour Party position. So there are 3 stages to this. We're at the first gate, if you like. We're going to have to see what happens. But I emphasise the point, because it is a really serious point. If this deal goes down, the Prime Minister, as well as Labour and across the House, is going to have to decide what we do next. I do not believe that this Prime Minister would countenance leaving without a deal. What Amber Rudd said yesterday, which is that the majority in Parliament won't allow it, is wrong. So we're going to have to decide what the options are at that stage.
Okay, and with that in mind, and you know, what about a yes or no answer? Are we closer to a second referendum in your view?
We are at exactly the same stage as we were yesterday and the day before, which is that stage 1, looking at the deal. So,
Sir Keir, where are we then? We seem to be stumbling along. isn't the truth of this that a significant number of Labour MPs will inevitably, in the end, just swing behind the May deal? Is that where we're headed, or are we headed to a second referendum?
Well, it's been suggested that Labour MPs are going to swing behind the deal, but I don't believe that to be true. And anybody listening to the debate this afternoon would have seen Labour MP after Labour MP condemning what's been brought back for the Prime Minister. So I think for the Prime Minister to assume that she can get by on Labour votes is an assumption she really shouldn't be making.
But isn't it time now, you know, when you should be putting all your cards on the table and either persuading your leader to go along with what you believe, which there should be a second vote, or to at least come out with what the Labour Party policy on this is, not just all options on the table?
Well, there are decisions to be made in a particular order. That's why we decided what we did at conference. First decision is on the deal, yes or no. We say no. We wait to see whether the deal goes down. So, of course, we're talking options because we don't know whether the deal will go down. If it goes down, then we'll call for a general election. We don't know whether that will succeed or not, and therefore we have to have options if there's a general election or not. And that's why if there's no general election, we've said all options, including a public vote. So it's a logical set of sort of structured decisions that have to be made. But each decision depends on what comes before it. So you can't sort of take the third decision before you've taken the first one.
All right, two quick questions to end. I mean, do you think this summit will happen on Sunday?
Yes, I do. But I think the problem is that the Prime Minister will return on Monday with the deal that she's presented this afternoon. It won't go through Parliament. OK, and finally, do you admire the Prime Minister? Do you admire the resilience and the tenacity that she's showing on this? I have respect for the Prime Minister and a lot more respect for her than I do for those on her benches who made promises about what Brexit would deliver and then either resigned at the first opportunity or refused to step up to the plate.
All right, and just finally, if there was a second referendum, I think I know which way you'd vote. Which way would Jeremy Corbyn vote?
Well, I would vote Remain. You'll have to ask Jeremy. I think in the past he said he would vote Remain.
And you think he will?
Well, you'll have to ask Jeremy that. I know what I would do.
All right, and in your heart of hearts, do you think he would go along with a second referendum?
Well, Jeremy is absolutely behind party policy, as am I, and that was agreed unanimously at the second day of our party conference. So Jeremy's behind it, I'm behind it, and the whole Labour Party's behind it. OK, very diplomatic.
Sir Keir, thank you very much indeed.
Theresa May has declared that a final Brexit deal is within Britain's grasp after agreement was reached on the UK's future relations with the EU. The Prime Minister insisted the political declaration was the right plan. But the deal was torn apart by all sides in the House of Commons. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, called the document 26 pages of waffle. And backbench Conservatives were equally scathing, saying Britain would be giving away control for years to come. It's further raised doubts over whether or not Mrs May will actually be able to win Parliament's support. From Westminster, here's our political correspondent, Paul Brand.
He might be too young to remember us joining the EU, but not to negotiate our departure. If the Austrian Chancellor has youth, well, today his host was claiming wisdom, trying to convince him and everyone else her Brexit deal is a good one. As this afternoon, the Prime Minister announced an agreement had been reached on our future relationship with the EU.
This is the right deal for the UK. It delivers on the vote of the referendum. The British people want this to be settled. They want a good deal that sets us on course for a brighter future. That deal is within our grasp, and I am determined to deliver it.
After last week's agreement on how we leave, today's document is about life afterwards. Among the 26 pages, a promise that technologies and alternative arrangements could help avoid the dreaded Northern Irish backstop, that Britain would have an independent trade policy, but the European Court of Justice keeps a role in resolving disputes, and a new fisheries policy could continue to give EU boats access to our waters. With not everyone willing to buy all that, this afternoon the Prime Minister made a sales call to the House of Commons.
Order. Statement. The Prime Minister.
At first, she tried to flatter a few tricky customers.
And I'm grateful to my right honourable friends, the members for Chingford and Woodford Green and for North Shropshire, for their ideas on this. Preparatory work...
But they weren't about to offer her much thanks in return, particularly over the Northern Irish backstop.
I would hope that she would now consider that none of this is at all workable.
We should junk forthwith the backstop, which makes a complete nonsense of Brexit.
The future relationship we have set out in the political declaration ends free movement, ends sending vast sums of money to the European Union every year, and ends the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice here in the United Kingdom.
At times, it's easy to forget that the official opposition sits in front of her.
This is waffle, the blindfold Brexit of a government that spent more time arguing with itself than negotiating for Britain.
So there is still no sign that this House will back her deal.
What more has the Prime Minister got to do to persuade you now to vote for her Brexit plan?
Well, I want her to succeed, and I want her, therefore, to recognise, and I believe she does recognise this, ironically, that this backstop is a toxic disaster for us if it remains in the withdrawal agreement.
So the Prime Minister may claim to fly the flag for Brexit, but still MPs refuse to rally to her banner. Paul Brand, ITV News, Westminster.
OK, so our political editor, Robert Peston, is in Downing Street for us now. So, Robert, does today's agreement actually change anything for the Prime Minister?
Well, look, the Prime Minister had personally wooed the former Tory leader Ian Duncan Smith to try and get him to back the deal and then persuade other Tory Brexiters to back the deal. But as Paul Brand just said, Ian Duncan Smith will not be turned. And right now, she is staring not just at defeat, but at a very big defeat for her deal. Because we also heard today from the DUP that it still thinks that the deal she's negotiated will drive a wedge between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. Now, in the coming weeks, the whips will put an enormous amount of pressure on Brexit-supporting Tory MPs and tell them that if they don't get this deal, they could end up with a chaotic no deal, or what they think is even more scary for them, no Brexit at all. But as I say, today it looks as though she is facing chaos, probably when that vote comes on December the 11th. And there's another reason why she is facing that chaos, because the document that she has published today tells us very, very little about what the shape of Brexit we will have in the years to come when we get through this 21-month period of transition. And for many MPs, they say we cannot, they say, pay over £39 billion for a Brexit future they simply can't see.
All right, Robert Peston in Downing Street, thank you. Well, away from the hostility in the House of Commons, there was at least some support for the Prime Minister's deal. The CBI, which speaks for UK businesses, officially welcomed it, saying it was a credit to both sides. However, the Confederation inadvertently let slip to ITV News that there are doubts within the organisation about the agreement. Our business editor, Joel Hills, explains.
The Confederation of British Industry claims to be the voice of business. Before the referendum, the vast majority of the 190,000 companies who are its members wanted Britain to remain in the European Union. But on Monday, the CBI gave a warm welcome to the Prime Minister, who plans to lead Britain out, and the draft deal she has negotiated.
It's not perfect, it's a compromise, but it's progress. It takes us back from the cliff edge, it avoids no deal, and it charts a potential path to a future frictionless trade deal. That is progress. We should not go backwards.
Today, the government and the EU updated their vision of their future relationship. The CBI issued a statement welcoming it. Josh Hardy, the CBI's Deputy Director General, said it appears that we're on the cusp of a much-needed agreement. This shows that a deal can be done, and businesses across the continent will be watching this weekend's EU summit closely. The statement added that progress made is a credit to both sets of negotiators, but hard work lies ahead. But the CBI also inadvertently sent ITV News internal emails, which highlight a difference between the CBI's public views about the political declaration and those held internally. The CBI's head of EU negotiations, Nicole Sykes, argued there was no need to give credit to the negotiators, I think, because it's not a good deal. The CBI's head of news, Chris Grummett, responded, "Have left the credit in, given we want this to go through." The quotation marks around the word want suggest doubts. The government needs all the help it can get if its draft deal is to clear Parliament. The CBI is backing it as the least worst option.
This is awkward, isn't it? What has the CBI said in response?
Well, tonight they've given us a statement, Mary. It says responding to significant announcements inevitably involves a step-by-step process, testing different viewpoints before arriving at a final public statement. The CBI and our members have been clear. The deal is not perfect. It involves compromise, hard work lies ahead, but right now it is the best chance of protecting jobs and growth. Look, in a sense, it shouldn't come as any great surprise that senior staff within the CBI harbour quite serious misgivings about the political declaration that we saw spout out today. It is vague, it's aspirational, and it's not legally binding. We could end up, it removes certainly the uncertainty the businesses hate in the short term, but beyond 2020, we could end up with a very close trading relationship. We could end up with an extremely distant one. The CBI has decided to back this deal, even if it considers to be a bad deal, because it's better than no deal, which the CBI thinks would be catastrophic.
All right, Jill, thank you.
Theresa May insisted a deal is within our grasp. This after a new draft document was published outlining what the UK's relationship with the EU will look like after Brexit. Downing Street appeared to be taken by surprise when the 26-page political declaration on trade, security and other issues was leaked out this morning. The Prime Minister then tried to sell the deal in the House of Commons, but struggled to convince Conservative MPs whose support she desperately needs to get it through Parliament. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
Well, we've been telling you to expect the Prime Minister on our sofa, and we're going to have to disappoint.
Suddenly, the Prime Minister's plans had to change. In Brussels, EU ambassadors were given the political declaration.
In a way, our job is done. As of 10:45 today.
Leaks meant a milestone moment was being tweeted out. The Prime Minister had to step in and shape the coverage. And after the Cabinet were hurriedly briefed in a telephone conference call, Number 10 announced there would be a statement to MPs, and before that, these words in Downing Street.
The British people want this to be settled. They want a good deal that sets us on course for a brighter future. That deal is within our grasp, and I am determined to deliver it.
The EU has inserted a series of phrases at the government's request, which it's clearly hoped will help Theresa May sell the deal to MPs. The declaration speaks of both sides' determination to replace the backstop somehow so it doesn't come into use. It says various technologies will be considered as one way of avoiding the backstop. It talks of the UK having an independent trade policy and underlines Brexit eventually means the end of free movement and possible visa requirements for long-term EU visitors. Her critics were more interested in the withdrawal agreement and the backstop that's in it.
There is a danger that should talks fail, the backstop becomes accepted. We have the horror of being in the customs union, the horror of Northern Ireland being split off under a different regime.
We should junk forthwith the backstop upon which the future economic partnership, according to this political declaration, is to be based, and which makes a complete nonsense of Brexit.
This, and I'd like the Prime Minister to confirm it, is not in any way legally binding. This is a draft treaty.
The Labour leader said it was thin stuff and largely waffle.
This half-baked deal is a product of 2 years of botched negotiations in which the Prime Minister's red lines have been torn up, cabinet resignations have been racked up and Chequers has been chucked. This is a vague menu of options, not a plan for the future and not capable of bringing our country together.
I have to say to him that on virtually everything he said in his response to my statement, he couldn't be more wrong. Indeed, I didn't believe that he'd actually even read the political declaration that we've published today, like the withdrawal agreement.
An even harder sell to Mrs May's Brexiteer hardliners were the declaration words hoping to build and improve on the single customs territory plans. The declaration says that the UK will consider aligning with EU rules on medicines, chemicals, plants and aerospace, a list many expect to increase, and that the EU and the UK aspire to a trading relationship on goods that is as close as possible, not the pure frictionless trade the Prime Minister wanted to have written in the deal.
There is a spectrum, that there is a balance between commitments that are given on rules and the issue of the checks that take place at the border. And it remains our intention as a government to work towards that frictionless trade.
That sliding scale of rule-taking in return for access to EU markets was why he resigned.
The top reason people voted to leave the EU was to take back democratic control over our laws. Isn't it the regrettable but inescapable reality that this deal gives even more away?
Prime Minister. Resign, one Labour MP joked. She clearly hadn't spoken to him in the busy week since he'd done just that.
And I think this is the first opportunity I had to be able to thank him for the work that he did as Brexit Secretary.
Theresa May couldn't emphasise enough she'd fought off an EU attempt to tie down access to British fishing waters.
We have firmly rejected a link between access to our waters and access to markets. The fisheries agreement is not something we will be trading off against any other priorities.
The EU senior negotiator quickly tweeted a cheeky riposte suggesting access to waters and market access had been linked, not in the language the EU wanted, ministers said. We asked two think tanks what the declaration really tells us.
And I think the EU has evidently moved and does want to find a way of making this work for both sides.
So there could be a compromise, even though the EU often told us it's either Norway or
But look, this is obviously a bespoke relationship, and the EU wants to find a way that the UK can actually make this work.
And there are parts of this political declaration which show that they have taken on board some of the UK's suggestions, some of the UK's asks, and but of course it will depend on whether they can make it work.
And whether they really want to. You used to work in the Commission. Do they write this sort of stuff sometimes and then go out the room and cross their fingers?
I mean, it is aspirational, yeah. So you know, it could be sort of good, you know, good intent and mood music, and actually when it comes to negotiating, it might be more difficult.
The British people want Brexit to be settled. They want a good deal that sets us on a course for a brighter future. And they want us to come together as a country and to move on, to focus on the big issues at home, like our NHS. The deal that will enable us to do this is now within our grasp. In these crucial 72 hours ahead, I will do everything possible to deliver it for the British people, and I commend this statement to the House.
Many thought that was Theresa May's strongest argument of the day. The people want this over with. The Chancellor of Austria, currently chairing the EU, called in to check on progress, and then, unusually for a national leader, chatted to the chief whip too. A shrewd move, given the reception the declaration got in the Commons today. Well, as you were hearing there, this is a very different document from the draft treaty, the withdrawal agreement. There's lots of aspirational language, lots of caveats, lots of adjectives. Everything is deep, broad and ambitious. And it is a very different document. What Theresa May has got here, though, is the sort of direction of travel that she wants to take policy in. I'm not sure it's where she always wanted to take policy, but where she wants to take the future relationship, that is in here. The Chequers isn't in here exactly what she was talking about in the summer, but the idea that we get more closely aligned with Europe in our regulations, maybe take some of their rules in return for freer access, closer to frictionless access for trade, that is in here. So she probably feels that she's got something here. But there is still absolute resistance in the House of Commons from Conservatives, from the DUP. They've got Boris Johnson coming to their rally this weekend, their conference. Nothing seems to have shifted there. We are 2 weeks away, probably, from the critical vote on this. A week is a long time in politics, but there aren't many weeks these days that seem to run in her direction.
Gary Gibbon in Westminster. Well, now, to thrash this all out, we have the government, the opposition and a former EU commissioner. First, to Justice Minister Rory Stewart, MP. Now, the lodestar to the negotiations, at least from a British point of view, was Chequers. Chequers isn't in this.
Doesn't explicitly refer to Chequers, but it has the same...
No frictionless trade.
It has the same basic principle. And I think in the end, of course, there are compromises and negotiations, so it's not going to be exactly like Chequers. But the big fact is there's agreement on control of free movement of people, so over immigration, but there's a lot of the advantages of single market access. And that is an achievement, because that's something that Europe probably a year ago would have said we couldn't have. They would have described that as cherry picking.
But we have talked all the time about frictionless trade, and that isn't in it.
What it defines is this, that the closer the regulations are, the closer the trade, and there's a phrase that reflects that, that if we deviate a great deal from the European Union, then checks would come in on borders. But that's to do with a very honest balance. The more ambitious we want to be about diverging from the EU, the more realistic we would have to be about what that would mean for
well, now, the European Court of Justice, so hated by the Brexiteers, will still dictate. I mean, basically, there's going to be an arbitration panel for difficult things, and whenever EU law comes into play, who will look at it? The ECJ.
So on the ECJ, that's only in relation to EU law. Just as in relation to British law, the British courts would hold. So it is taking away the ECJ jurisdiction over British law, but it's a concession that over EU law
I'm afraid I haven't
implemented
spotted the phrase British courts.
Well, it's very clear that the ECJ refers only to EU law, not to British law. And that's important, because it's right and proper that the ECJ should have a say over EU law, but the point is we're leaving the European Court of Justice when it comes to domestic legislation.
You would say there's not a parity of respect. If you're going to mention the EU Court of Justice, then perhaps you ought to mention British justice.
So, John, I mean, I think there are many things that you and I can find in this document to pick over, but I think the big shift is that it is a much, much friendlier, warmer document from the EU than you perhaps would have expected 6 months ago. And in some ways, what's really significant is what's not in the document. So they're not saying you can only have Canada or Norway. They're not repudiating a close relationship. In fact, the entire document seems to suggest that people who said the EU was setting out to somehow punish Britain were wrong. This represents a turn in the relationship where genuinely it seems that both sides want to get to a warmer relationship. And that is a huge progress in terms of the next 2 years of negotiation.
Well, of course, you were somebody who voted Remain. And the fact is that the loudest noise today has come from the Brexiteers, who say this is totally unacceptable.
From my point of view, this has to be a deal that brings as many people in the country as possible together. It can't be a hard Brexit deal, and it certainly can't be a second referendum deal. It has to be something that acknowledges the Brexit referendum happened, gives control over borders, but at the same time acknowledges people who voted for Remain are worried about the economy, they want a close relationship with Europe. This is a document which lays out all the way from human rights to foreign and political cooperation that we want to be Europe's closest partners in the world. And I think that's right, because we have to heal the country.
But we do have to sort of accept that if they're going to be as loud as this when it comes to voting, they're going to be voting no, and they're going to reject it, and then where are we?
Have to make the argument again and again, and the argument
has to be... Do you think you'll persuade them? Did you see the faces of Ian Duncan-Smith, Jacob Rees-Mogg? I could list them all.
So clearly, I'm not going to be able to persuade everybody, but in the end, this can only be done if the public accepts two basic principles, that we're not going to have a second referendum and simply pretend the first referendum didn't happen, on the one hand, and we're not going to go for a no-plan, no-deal Brexit. Once you've accepted that, you end up somewhere in this territory, and the political agreement, for my money, is a very good, warm statement by the UK and the EU of where that
That's interesting, because the other day, Mrs May said the choice was my deal, no deal, or remain in the European Union. You're saying she was wrong. You can't remain in the European Union.
So I'm saying that once you've accepted that you don't want to have remain in the European Union, once you've accepted you don't want to have no deal, no plan Brexit, you end up here. I mean, if we had more time, I could suggest why I think it would be very dangerous and politically polarizing to try to have a second referendum. But I think if you accept, as almost all MPs do, that they don't want a second referendum, they don't want a hard Brexit, then it's this. And I think what's interesting here is that this is France, Germany and the EU making a much better goodwill effort than you would have thought they would have done 6 months ago.
OK, hand on heart, what you've read today, you really believe that it is better than what we have at the moment?
In one very important respect, it respects the result of the referendum, and that's where you and I might disagree. So I'm not arguing that it's going to be a huge economic improvement necessarily, but it respects the result of the referendum, gives us control over immigration. It shows that vote happened, and politically, that is so much more important and is a huge improvement on trying to pretend that referendum didn't happen.
Rory Stewart, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Well, I'm joined now by the Shadow Brexit Secretary, Sir Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer, is there anything in the realm of reality that would make you and your party vote for this deal?
Well, the deal presented to us this afternoon is so vague, just sort of listing the options, that we couldn't possibly vote for it. Now, that's not a new criticism. We said months ago to the Prime Minister, when it comes to the future relationship, we know it won't be legally binding, but we do need detail and precision. We need to know where we're heading, and don't come back with something which is vague. She's done precisely that, and it's impossible to back something as vague as this.
Well, if you're going to vote that way, if you're going to vote the deal down, and we know how some of the Brexiteers are going to vote and the DUP, it's a no deal then.
No, I don't accept.
But that's the inevitable conclusion of that vote in Parliament. If you vote against it, there will not be a deal.
I do not. I've been saying for weeks and for months that the majority in Parliament does not accept this false choice between a bad deal and even worse. And I've said for a long time that the majority will not give authority to the Prime Minister to proceed to no deal. Now, yesterday, Amber Rudd said precisely the same thing as me from her position within the Cabinet. We will have to make a difficult decision when and if the deal is voted down. But simply to proceed to no deal would be reckless, and I don't think this Prime Minister wants to do that, and she certainly won't have authority to do that.
But that's precisely what you're going to do. You are going to be reckless with the state of the country's economy, because when you vote against this deal, the pound will probably crash, the stock market might hit the floor. These are the risks that you're running.
What would be reckless is to simply sign up to a bad deal because the Prime Minister's run down the clock. And if I was coming on your programme to say it's inadequate in all these respects, it isn't good for the country, it's not going to safeguard manufacturing, but guess what, Labour's going to vote for it, you would be challenging me uphill and down dale. It is not reckless to say it's not right for the country to vote for a bad deal.
But the only way you would get the outcome that you want is if you were in power. The only way that would happen if there was a general election. Hang on a minute. And the only way you can get a general election is if there's a vote of no confidence that you win. So why don't you go to that vote of no confidence now?
Well, because we haven't yet had the vote on the deal. And we need to have that vote on the deal. What we've been saying to the Prime Minister for a long time is there is a majority in Parliament for a comprehensive customs union and for a single market deal. The Prime Minister is praised for a sort of resilience, but what she's really doing is ploughing on without listening what's being said to her from both sides of the House. And what you can't do now is to say, well, I've run the clock down, this has got the word deal at the top and signatures at the bottom, so you're going to have to vote for it.
Jeremy Corbyn recently told Der Spiegel, the German magazine, that Brexit cannot be stopped. Brexit cannot be stopped. Do you agree with him?
I think he said we can't stop Brexit, but what I've been clear about is that Brexit can be stopped. But the question we're facing at the moment is not that question, but a different question, which is this deal good enough? And the answer to that is no from the opposition, and it looks like it's no from quite big chunks of the Tory party.
Right. So to be clear, if there was a people's vote, a second referendum, would you vote Remain?
Yes, I voted Remain last time, and I would vote Remain again if that was an option.
How would Jeremy Corbyn vote?
Well, you'll have to ask Jeremy about that. I think in the past he has said he'd vote Remain, but you'll have to ask Jeremy about that.
Wouldn't it be good to get a little bit of clarity on how the party leader would vote on this?
Well, what we did at party conference was try to map out the decisions in the order that we're going to have to take them. First decision is on the deal. What are we going to do? And we said we'll apply the test that we've had in place for 18 months. If the deal goes down, we then answered the next question, what will you do next? We said we'll call for a general election. So clarity there. If we press on, if there is no general election, all options on the table, including a public vote. Now, that's what Jeremy signed up to. It's what I'm signed up to. The whole Labour Party is signed up to that. And actually, there's huge support for it across the party and across the trade union movement.
Got to leave it there. Keir Starmer, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, joining me now from Brussels is the former EU Trade Commissioner and former Director General of the World Trade Organization, Pascal Lamy. Pascal Lamy, wonderful to have you on the programme. You've had both jobs, so you're in a unique position to kind of judge both scenarios. So when Theresa May says that Britain can be a de facto member of a customs union in a transitional phase, but at the same time stitch together an independent trade policies with outside partners, is she telling the truth?
Well, I think the truth is that if you are a member of a customs union, which is about goods, not services, although there may be questions about that, the reality is that you are bound by the group to which you belong within the customs union for what the external policy of this customs union. Customs union means you have the same customs around the union. And what is on the table is a sort of deal where UK exits as much as possible politically and as little as possible economically. And this customs union issue, as we all know, stems from the problem that you cannot have a border between Northern and Southern Ireland. So the customs union has to do with Ireland.
Okay, but while we're in this twilight zone of trade, are we in a position to cobble together independent trade deals with other countries? Is that allowed?
For goods.
For goods.
I'll give you my answer, frank answer. For goods, the answer is no. For services, the answer is maybe.
But this is precisely what she has promised to her party and to Parliament and to the country. It is one of the key pillars of her sales pitch to Britain at the moment.
We all know, you and me, why, for the moment, the United Kingdom has to remain within the EU customs union until the day, if this day ever comes, that you can have free trade, open trade, between UK and the EU, while UK will be outside the customs union, if that comes one day, because you have this problem of the Irish border.
All right. Now, if we went to WTO rules, so if we crashed out, we went to WTO rules, how bad would that be for Britain?
Well, trade regimes are like football leagues. You have the first division, the second division, the third division, and the fourth division.
Okay,
the
well, what division would that be?
Is the internal market.
Yeah.
Exit. That would be, you would move from Division 1 to Division 4.
So that's not great, is it?
No, not great. 2 is worse than 1, 3 is worse than 2, and 4 is worse than 3. Well, but that's what the WTO regime is. The WTO regime is the common denominator between Bangladesh and Canada.
Okay, now just one other one. It took Canada 7 years to cobble together a trade deal with the EU, and at the very last moment there was a hurdle because the region of Wallonia in Belgium voted against it. How many years do you think it would take Britain to cobble together a trade deal with the EU?
My guess is it would take roughly 4 to 5 years, because on the one side UK is much bigger than Canada, which is why it should be more complex, but on the other side we start from a situation which is very different. We start from a situation where there is total free trade between the United Kingdom and the continent, and the question would be, how do we have less free trade than what we have, and not the problem we had to solve with Canada, which is how can we have more free trade than what we have.
Okay. Pascal Lamy, thank you very much indeed.
Back to Brexit, and one of the issues of most disagreement is over fishing. Is Britain taking back control of its waters or sacrificing control for trading deals? Time and time again, MPs stood up with concerns to do with fishing. One man who has put his neck on the line more than once is the Secretary of State for Scotland, David Mundell. Our Scotland correspondent, Kieran Jenkins, is in Edinburgh tonight. Kieran.
Well, John, we're in the territory now of different people reading the same text and coming to completely contradictory positions. You have a number of Tory MPs and the SNP, by the way, saying this is a sellout, a betrayal of the fishing industry, and then other Tory MPs and the Prime Minister saying we become an independent coastal state and there is no trade-off of fishing quotas for market access. Then throw in the EU negotiators, and that's not what they seem to think they're getting, if you believe a tweet from the Deputy Chief Negotiator this afternoon. So very little consensus across the board. But as you say, one man with many red lines on fishing is the Scottish Secretary, David Mundell. I've been asking him about them, and first of all, he told me why he thinks this Brexit deal is the best practical option.
The deal that's on offer is what's available compared to what the alternatives are, and the alternatives are a potential no deal, crashing out of the EU in 4 months' time, or going into the uncertainty, division, possibly chaos around having another EU referendum or a general election, which nobody wants.
You set out your red lines. What did you think you were going to do if they weren't met?
I set out three positions, in fact. One in relation to ensuring that we didn't see a customs border down the Irish Sea, and fishing, which is a hugely important issue in Scotland, but also warning of the danger of no deal. What I have to do is to make a judgment on what, in relation to the most important of my red lines, is the integrity of the United Kingdom.
Your red line said we cannot remain in the common fisheries policy beyond December 2020. The deal allows for exactly that.
The deal allows for us to become an independent coastal state. But I'm absolutely clear. That is my position. We leave the common fisheries policy in December 2020.
But the deal doesn't say that. The deal says that if the transition period is extended, we remain in the common fisheries policy beyond December 2020. If that was a red line for you, you should have resigned.
I am very clear that I would not support the extension of the transition period if we have not left the common fisheries policy.
You said that you can't support a deal if it provides for a new agreement on access and quota shares. This deal provides for a new agreement on access and quota shares.
I said that I could not support a deal that provided a predetermined agreement. This agreement allows us to negotiate access and quota shares.
What you actually said was that you wouldn't support a deal that had any pre-existing arrangement in force. What is this if not a pre-existing arrangement? A deal, surely by definition, is an arrangement, is it not?
What my words, I think anybody looking objectively mean is that we would not have set out what the quota arrangements and what the access arrangements were going to be with the EU ahead of leaving the EU.
Some of your colleagues strongly disagree with you, Conservative MPs, they're saying this is a betrayal of Brexit.
I just don't agree with that.
After months in which Brexit talks moved at a glacial pace, things are suddenly accelerating. There's real wheeling and dealing going on. Over the past few days, as the EU finalised its political declaration summarising the future relationship with this country, for one thing, that took some knocking together of heads when some countries looked like they wouldn't sign it. And in Westminster, meanwhile, discussions are intensifying over who might support the withdrawal agreement. That's the divorce deal covering the immediate separation issues. Parliament must vote on it soon if the UK is to avoid a so-called no-deal Brexit next March. The parliamentary maths doesn't look good for Theresa May. And later we'll step through what might happen during this crucial next fortnight. But first, here's our political editor, Nick Watt.
We've been waiting and waiting, and now the deal is almost done. Theresa May has reached agreement with Brussels on the legally binding withdrawal agreement and an aspirational declaration on the future partnership.
The British people want this to be settled. They want a good deal that sets us on course for a brighter future. That deal is within our grasp, and I am determined to deliver it.
If EU leaders accept the deal, Parliament will decide whether it stands or falls. There was something of a rocky start today.
We can accept the generalities and the self-contradictions contained in this political declaration, but we should junk forthwith the backstop upon which the future economic partnership, according to this political declaration, is to be based, and which makes a complete nonsense of Brexit.
Number 10 hopes to win over Tory doubters with a grand Brexit bargain. An ambitious future trading partnership is meant to sweeten the pill for Brexiteers alarmed by the exit terms, specifically plans to keep the UK in a customs union until no hard border in Northern Ireland can be guaranteed.
I think we've all said, you know, this deal is not 100% perfect for the UK, but is also a much more bespoke deal than they've given any other country. This leads to potentially much deeper trade, much deeper cooperation, that deep and close partnership that the Prime Minister's always said she wanted to have.
There are wins and losses for the Prime Minister. On the upside, she can say the Northern Ireland backstop could be replaced by technological solutions. The EU acknowledges the UK will end free movement for its citizens, and both sides want to create a free trade area with no tariffs on goods. But there is no mention of the Prime Minister's long-stated goal to guarantee frictionless trade, and the European Court of Justice will play a decisive role in future disputes. A former Conservative leader is worried about the Northern Ireland backstop.
The backstop does not have to be agreed by anybody. It is binding on us in the absence of any other arrangement. So we will be in the backstop, and that is toxic because it means we have a border down the Irish Sea, and it means that we are then locked into the customs union, and the EU has a 50% share of the decision as to whether we can ever leave. That is constitutionally unprecedented, and that has to go.
It's not just Tory Brexiteers who are complicating the Prime Minister's plans to secure parliamentary support.
Parliament's reached an impasse, and we should be honest about that. There's no, I think, sort of consensus within Parliament for any of the possible arrangements. There's no consensus around no deal, there's no consensus around Canada plus or Norway or the Prime Minister's deal, and I think we have reached gridlock, and the sooner we're honest about that, because we are running out of road here, the sooner we can say this is the reality of the situation, let's extend Article 50 to allow for there to be a people's vote on the actual Brexit reality deal.
Given the hostile reception in Parliament, Number 10 is being remarkably upbeat tonight. Aides say they can now focus on the UK's future relationship with the EU rather than the politically troublesome departure. I'm happier, one Brexit cabinet minister told me. Other ministers are having a long think about their future. Parliament will soon decide the fate of Theresa May's Brexit plan. With more than 80 Tories pledging to vote it down, Labour could play a decisive role in shaping Brexit.
Well, just to remind us all how this is not going to be simple the next days and weeks, Nick is here now with news of an intervention by the Spanish Prime Minister.
That's right. Angela Merkel, German Chancellor, made it pretty clear that she wants this done and dusted by Sunday. But this evening, as you say, Pedro Sanchez has upped the ante with, as you say, a very punchy tweet on Gibraltar. Now, this is what he said: after my conversations with Theresa May, our positions remain far away. My government will always defend the interests of Spain. And then here's the key bit: if there are no changes, we will veto Brexit. Now, obviously, no one country has a veto over what's due to be agreed on Sunday, because that is concluding the Article 50 process, which is done through qualified majority voting.
The withdrawal agreement,
that's right.
That part of it.
But the future trade relationship, which will be decided after we have left the EU, every member state has a veto on that. And interestingly, buried in the bottom of an interview with Politico today, the Spanish Prime Minister said that in those talks, he'd want to have a bilateral conversation with the UK in which he would put the shared sovereignty between the UK and Spain, shared sovereignty over Gibraltar. The UK is absolutely opposed to that because it applies the principle of self-determination to the future of Gibraltar, and the people of Gibraltar have overwhelming support for remaining under the British Crown, so UK would say no to that.
Thank you very much, Nick. Well, we'll ask a minister about some of that in just a moment. First, though, the attitude of Labour will be key in the coming days. And tonight I sat down with Sir Keir Starmer, the shadow Brexit secretary, and I asked exactly what Labour is willing to do to avoid a hard Brexit.
We're going to work with the majority in Parliament. If this deal goes down, the whole House has to decide what to do next. I've said many times that I think the majority will not allow the Prime Minister to simply proceed to no deal. Amber Rudd said the same thing yesterday in almost the same terms as me, and nobody in the Cabinet has contradicted her. So we are all going to have to think about what we do, but I am confident that the majority will say we are not going to countenance no deal.
And if she comes back with an amended proposal, could that do it?
Well, we'll see. We've always said we'll judge each part of the agreement when we see it. And we didn't pass judgment until we saw it. I think the problem is this: people say, well, the Prime Minister's resilient, and she is, but she's ploughing on towards, I think, probably losing this vote, but not listening to what people are saying.
But some of those things, I mean, like shading in the fine detail on a single market relationship. That's not going to happen at this point, is it?
Well,
that's not what the withdrawal agreement is about.
It's frankly a document that could and should have been produced at the beginning of the 2-year negotiations.
But it
it's
couldn't
not a
be,
document
not under the Article 50 process,
well,
which always said we wouldn't work out the details until we were out. It always said that.
No, I appreciate that, and I appreciate it's not legally binding. But at the end of the exercise, you would expect a document to say, we've agreed X, Y, Z, this is the course, this is what we're going to achieve, we now need to put the detail on it, we need to sign it off as a legally binding document.
It doesn't close off things you want, though. It doesn't close off...
Well, what it does close off is a comprehensive customs union, and the Prime Minister has repeatedly said, including today, that she does not intend or plan for that. So it closes off the very thing that we think is really important, and it leaves everything else in vague terms. And really...
Vagueness, though, isn't bad for you, in a sense. You hope to win a general election at some point during this process, don't you? It won't... If it's vague, it's good, in a sense. Well, you should be ready to support something that doesn't tie your hands in the future.
Among the problems with vague is that it could lead to a very hard Brexit, and it's quite clear that as a sort of Canada-style arm's-length economic relationship is quite possible under this document. Now, you cannot expect the Labour Party to sign off a document that could end in that place, and that's the problem. That's why the criticism I put today is not new. I said months ago, we need precision and we need a plan. And if you come back with something that's vague, that is, as it were, a blind Brexit, you don't know where you're going, and that's not going to be good enough.
And if, despite discussions that might take place after it fails to pass a vote, it doesn't look like there is a compromise available, then the UK is heading for no deal, or do you at that point favour the people's vote option, the second referendum? At what point does the Labour Party get behind that? Because obviously you like the idea, but it doesn't look like Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell like the idea.
Well, we had that debate at our party conference. We tried to think about the decisions that would arise for us in the order they'd arise, and that's why our policy says first look at the deal and vote it down if it's not good enough, where we're at that stage. If the deal falls, there really ought to be a general election, and there ought to be, because it would be a failure of the negotiations. We know that's not in our gift, so we went on at conference to say, if you can't get a general election, other options, including a public vote, ought to be on the table. So we get to each decision as it arises.
So in terms of decisions you have to take very soon about what might be required to get Labour support for this bill, what are you looking for? Well, something stronger on the customs union?
A comprehensive, permanent customs union that protects manufacturing and gives us a say in trade policy with the EU. Now, that's the position that we spelt out in some detail, I think, as long ago as February. It remains the position. And the reason for that is because I genuinely do not think that manufacturing in this country can be properly protected without it.
And if Theresa May concedes that point, the Labour Party would vote for this?
I genuinely don't think that the solemn commitment to no hard border in Northern Ireland can be achieved without it. Now, what Theresa May has said every time she's made a statement is that is the one thing she is not going to deliver. It's the one thing she's not even aiming for. Now, if she's going to reflect...
She bends on that.
If she reflects between now and the vote, we'll look at what she brings back. It wouldn't be the only thing, but at the moment, she has shown no inclination or sign of reaching for the majority in Parliament on this.
You say that you know how you would vote if there was a people's vote. I believe you've said that today, that you would vote to remain.
Yes.
And your party leader was not able to answer that question. Do you think the party is going to hold together in the next few days?
I do, and I'll tell you for why, and I'm not going to pretend there aren't differences. We had our argument at conference, we agreed on the roadmap, and I have been really struck by how united the party's been behind that, including the parliamentary party, and I engage with the party all the time. Now, of course, we've got to hold that together. Of course, we've got to keep speaking to each other, but I do genuinely believe that the Labour Party is more united on this issue at the moment than probably any time in the last 2 years.
Well, that's the Labour position then. Let's examine the government's perspective more closely now with Treasury Minister Mel Stride. Welcome. Can we just start off quickly with the Spanish Prime Minister's tweet this evening? How much of a concern is that language about Gibraltar for you in the government?
Well, I think a very important point here, Mark, is that we are not going to compromise on the sovereignty issue around Gibraltar, and the Prime Minister's made it very clear that we are going to enter into a final deal here, which is good for the UK and also for Gibraltar.
But could that wreck this then?
Well, not at this stage, it certainly couldn't, because this would be something that's being played into, by the sounds of it, the future partnership negotiations, which are clearly a little bit further down the line. But I think you'd have to say it would be, I think, quite unusual if something like that with one particular country was used to be a spanner in the works of an entire deal for 28 countries.
Potentially,
our position is clear on this.
Potentially, though, a bit of a ticking bomb in the process. When you get to the final deal, the trade deal, you will need unanimous agreement across...
There will be a number of issues, no doubt, that surface and disappear over the coming months as we go through this process. But the important thing that will underpin this is we now have within our grasp, within our sight, the possibility here of a really good deal for the UK, a good deal for the European Union, something that's going to preserve jobs, keep the economy going. It's going to be good for business. It's going to give us that ability to take control of our borders and our money and our laws and all the things that the 2016 referendum told us that the British people wanted. We've got a real opportunity here to deliver this now.
Now, obviously, the immediate business is getting that divorce agreement, the withdrawal agreement through. But that political declaration, it was said, for example, last week, one of the things that was briefed out was that would help the process of getting the withdrawal agreement through Parliament in the next week or two. Do you think anybody's been convinced by what we've heard from the political declaration in Parliament that they should support the withdrawal agreement as that comes up for a vote for the next
What the
week?
political declaration sets out very clearly and is agreed by both sides is that at the heart of this arrangement is going to be a unique and very deep and meaningful free trade agreement. So we'll not have tariffs, we'll not have quotas between ourselves and the EU 27. We will get control of our borders, so an end of free movement. We'll not be paying vast sums of money over to the European Union, and we will not be subject to EU law. And also, very importantly, this is going to underpin confidence in the economy again. If we get this deal, we can not only just get the economy moving and protect jobs and protect living standards, but we'd also start actually beginning to talk about a lot of the other things that matter, Mark, other than Brexit, the things that the government is doing to make sure we do the right things by the country.
But do you think it's convinced anyone in terms of the withdrawal agreement and the parliamentary cut and thrust that has to happen over the next 2 weeks?
Look, I think we're in
Has that changed much?
We are in a process, and what has changed now that we have a real deal on the table is exactly that. We're no longer speculating and people pushing in one direction, trying to change things in different ways. We're dealing with a real deal here. And this decision cannot be taken in a vacuum. So what all parliamentarians across the House of Commons have to look at is not just the deal that delivers in the way that I've described, but what are the alternatives? Now, the alternatives is to go into uncharted territory. It could end up that we end up with no Brexit at all, that we come out at the end of March with the economic damage that that is going to inflict. It could mean, conceivably, that we don't leave the European Union at all, which I think would be a gross betrayal of that referendum result back in 2016, be a thoroughly undemocratic outcome. And so the best deal, the best option, and this is why I think it will prevail, it'll be bumpy, but it will prevail, is this deal that honours that referendum, protects our economy, and also protects the integrity of the United Kingdom.
The terms in which you've just been speaking about respecting the result are obviously good for elements of your own party. But in terms of what we were hearing from Keir Starmer, and, you know, if you don't get the DUP on side, you may well be looking to Labour votes to help you get this through. What can you say to them? I mean, you know what he wants. He wants a commitment to a full-on customs union type arrangement.
Yes. Well, the DUP have expressed very clear concerns around the backstop, and the Prime Minister's been very clear about our approach to that, which is firstly that we have negotiated a UK-wide customs union to be part of the backstop, which is not something that the EU were originally offering. And secondly, we will only be entering into the backstop in the highly unlikely event that we haven't done the deal. And what this arrangement is saying is that we have to
wind up, do you think you will be relying relying on Labour votes too.
Well, let's see how we go forward. What I definitely think is that every parliamentarian, including within my party now, is looking at a very real deal, a deal that the rest of the world told us could never be achieved. We've got a deal now with the EU. It's a good deal. The decision cannot be taken in a vacuum. It has to be compared to very unpalatable alternatives. It's a good deal for this country, and I think ultimately it will get through Parliament.
Mel Stride, thank you very much for joining us. So the next fortnight will indeed be crucial, but how will it unfold? Some predict where the Prime Minister's push will land her. Others have all but given up on trying to work out a route from here to March the 29th. What hasn't been lost, though, amid the din, are the voices of those so keen to tell us what they want to happen next. Well, tonight we want to move beyond that to try to answer that most unanswerable of questions: what on earth is actually going to happen? And we're joined here in the studio at the whiteboard by Hannah White from the Institute for Government, Stephen Bush of the New Statesman, and LBC broadcaster Ian Dale. And there's one simple rule here: these guys aren't allowed to tell us what they want to happen next. Instead, they'll try to lay out what they think actually will happen. Using our extraordinary whiteboard, you can see how careful we've been with your licence fees. So, Stephen Bush, can you lead off? What do you think is going to be the path through this next fortnight?
Well, I think the first thing that's going to happen is obviously there'll be a vote on this withdrawal agreement right here. So we'll start here. And basically, the majority of people in the Commons want to avoid two things. They want to avoid May's deal, but they really, really want to avoid no deal. So what I think is going to happen is the first thing is you'll have a big no vote to May's deal.
Probably around the 10th of December?
Probably around the 10th of December. I don't think there'll be a Tory leadership election. In the House today, you could really hear that although there's a large minority who don't like the deal, the majority of the party is rallying behind Theresa May in a way they weren't even a week ago. So the next thing will happen is the Labour Party is going to desperately try to trigger a general election with a no-confidence vote. And then what's going to happen is they're just going to bounce straight off the Fixed Term Parliament Act. Then a bunch of pro-Europeans are going to try and get a second referendum, and they're going to bounce right off the fact there aren't enough votes for it. And then all this time's going to be tick, 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 ticking to no deal. But no one wants that. So eventually, some Labour people, some second referendum people, some people who don't like May's deal are going to have to hold their noses and vote for May's deal in order to prevent that. I think that's what will happen.
Hannah, follow the bouncing ball was almost Stephen's version, but what's yours?
Well, I'm going to give the Prime Minister the benefit of the doubt and say there's an outside possibility of a yes vote, but no one in Westminster seems to think at the moment that that's going to happen. So I think what's more likely is that the meaningful vote that Parliament is being given by the government is going to start out with a no vote. But the important thing about that is that it's not actually a yes-no vote. It's a vote where parliamentarians get to put down amendments. And what's going to be really important when this vote takes place is what it reveals about where the other majorities are in the House of Commons. And so it's going to tell us a lot, and it's going to inform everyone's thinking. But it's going to inform the Prime Minister's thinking about whether everyone's going to be really shocked if there's a no vote, and maybe she can just try again straight away, or whether, if she gets the chance, if, as Stephen says, there are other things that throw her off course, if she wants to try for an amended deal and offer a different...
Or go back to the EU.
Go back to the EU. There's limited time for that, and then put an amended deal back to the House. I'm not going to go beyond that, because I think those are the two options that she'll have at that stage, either to go straight back and say, look, this is my deal, take it or leave it, or to offer the House something different.
Before we pick up with Ian, if these amendments go in, and there are lots of them, do you think Parliament can actually manage the complexity of what has to happen next week and the beginning of the week after?
Well, I think the Speaker will play a role in that, in the way he always does. So the Speaker has to take a view on which amendments there may be a significant interest in. He has to balance the interests of minorities, people who need to be able to express their view, and the interests, and think about where there might actually be a majority view.
All right, Ian, you're up.
Well, I think that there's undoubtedly going to be a no vote to begin with. I don't think there's any question about that. I think it's just a question of the size of the majority, which I think could be a lot larger than people are thinking. Now, there are two options then. Parliament could mandate Theresa May to go back to Brussels, but there is no prospect that the EU is going to waver there and give her a better deal than they're giving now. So I don't agree with Hannah that that's a possibility. I think there is something that comes in between this, and that is, as Stephen said, a confidence vote. I interviewed Keir Starmer tonight, and he more or less said, yeah, that's what we would... He didn't say, yes, we would definitely do it.
Well, feel free to mark that on the board,
let's
then.
Put your own... a con there, confidence vote. Now, Theresa May will probably win that, but bear in mind that this is her flagship policy, and most prime ministers in these circumstances would probably think about resignation at that point. Now, I'm not going to predict that she will resign, but what I would predict is that those 48 letters will be in within a couple of days. Now, I still think she would win that leadership election vote, but the margin, I think, would be relatively narrow, much narrower than it would have been if there'd been a leadership election now. So if she survives that, what then? And I don't know what then. And I think all of us can probably agree that we actually don't know what will happen. There are so many imponderables here that it's very difficult to see what would happen, and it will be on a day-to-day basis. I mean, events will take their course.
How long would a leadership election... Well, no, it's great. How long would a leadership election normally take? And do you think it could be running on in parallel with some of these other things, like trying to get amendments or...
The big danger of a Tory leadership election is that it will take the normal 3 months. Now, I've talked to some people quite high up in central office who said, well, they wouldn't concertina. It has to go to the party membership. There's no talk of somebody being crowned like Theresa May was. I think they could concertina it into probably a month to 6 weeks if they really wanted to. But even then, that would mean that a new leader would come in, probably want to try and go back and tweak the deal at least. They can't do that before March the 29th, so a new leader would probably have to try to withdraw Article 50. Now, Theresa May could never do that, and she might have to say, in these circumstances, she would try.
Article 50?
Well, or postpone it, I mean. And, I mean, imagine the consequences of that. And in a leadership campaign, all the candidates are going to be asked that question. Boris Johnson has already mentioned that he would do that. But I'm not sure any candidate who says they'll do that would win.
Thanks. Stephen, just hearing what Keir Starmer was saying this evening, what Mel Stride was saying this evening, if the government did make meaningful concessions on, for example, a customs union, one or two other issues of concern to the Labour Party, could they just kick it in effectively to the political agreement? Could they say, well, yes, of course, we'll agree now with you that that's what we'll do, and turn a lot of Labour MPs to vote for it in that way?
Well, yeah, the kind of escape hatch for the government is the political declaration. Not binding at all, just some warm words about the future relationship. But by changing that, you can potentially see how a bunch of Labour MPs can be moved over. I think in the first vote, however, the Labour Party feels it has to show to its own voters that it's trying to force an election, that it doesn't like this Tory Brexit, etc., etc. So whatever happens, all of that stuff can only really come into play after the Labour Party has had its demonstration of its good intent to its Remain voters.
Hannah, I mean, a lot of this is, I presume, in parliamentary terms, virgin territory. I mean, what are the dangers here of miscalculation? I mean, we were just talking about how long a Conservative leadership contest might last.
Well, I think the really important thing to bear in mind is that all the defaults at the moment are set to no deal. So, actually, what needs to happen if no deal is not going to happen is we need to have a meaningful vote, which needs to pass, and then the Parliament needs to pass a piece of legislation. We need to agree a treaty. And that will have to happen before Article 50 runs out. And the point about Article 50 is that the EU have to unanimously give us an extension. It's not just up to us
Not just for a Tory leadership contest. No, Ian, last word.
The point also is the Clerk of the House of Commons, Sir David Natzler, has said that any amendments to this motion that we'll get on December the 10th, frankly, aren't worth anything because Parliament can pass all the amendments it likes, but in the end, it's the government. The legislation governs that if there isn't a deal, we have to go to no deal. So Hannah's absolutely right. There would have to be primary legislation to stop that happening.
None of you, I've noticed, have mentioned the second referendum, really, as a runner in this. Too complex, too
there aren't enough Conservatives who would vote for it. There'll be about 25 Labour MPs who would not vote for it, even if Jeremy Corbyn changed his mind, which is a pretty big if.
It'd be more than that.
And there's no way that there are enough Conservative MPs floating around to get it over the line.
There'll be a lot of noise about it over the next few weeks, an increasing noise, but it ain't going to happen.
Thank you very much. Ian Dale, Hannah White, Stephen Bush, thank you all very much for joining us and plotting that through. Fascinating.
I've been